There is a number the Soviet government never wanted the world to calculate. If 3 men had failed to find what they were looking for in a flooded tunnel beneath a burning reactor, scientists estimated that a significant portion of Europe would have been rendered uninhabitable for centuries. Most people know Chernobyl as an explosion. A disaster that happened was contained became a cautionary tale. What most people don't know is that the explosion was not the worst thing that almost happened. The worst thing almost happened 3 days later, underground, in the dark. April 26, 1986. A routine safety test. A reactor its own engineers believed was impossible to destroy. By morning, it had exploded, and what followed would become the most dangerous secret in Soviet history. The test was never supposed to happen at night. It had been delayed 3 times. It was designed for the day shift, experienced operators, full supervision, proper preparation. Instead, an unexpected surge in electricity demand pushed it back hour after hour, until it fell to a crew that had not been briefed. A team handed a procedure document and told to run it anyway. To run the test, operators had to bring the reactor's power down to a low, controlled level. The power dropped too far, almost to zero. An operator named Leonid Toptunov fought to stabilize it. He pulled it back to about 7% of design capacity. Every protocol said stop. The test supervisor, Anatoly Dyatlov, ordered them to continue. Dyatlov did not accept hesitation. Over years, he had built an environment where questioning his decisions was not a realistic option. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. 23 seconds later, 2 explosions ripped through the building. The second blew the 1,000-ton roof off the reactor hall and sent burning graphite raining across the surrounding area. Reactor number 4 no longer existed. And the people driving toward the glow they could see from miles away had no idea what they were driving into. They were told to stop 3 times. They didn't stop. The first responders arrived within minutes. They were trained for fires. Not one of them knew that what burned inside that building could not be fought with water. The call came in at 1:28 a.m., a fire at Chernobyl. The Pripyat station dispatched its crews within minutes. They had no radiation suits, no proper dosimeters. No one told them what had happened inside that building. When they arrived, they saw a partially collapsed structure, graphite blocks scattered across the roof and surrounding ground, and fire burning at the top of the reactor hall. They climbed up to fight it. Some of them picked up the graphite with their bare hands to clear the roof so they could work. They didn't know they were holding pieces of the reactor core, material so radioactive that seconds of exposure would exceed a lifetime's safe limit. Lieutenant Pravik, one of the first men on the roof, was 23 years old. Through the night, the men worked. Some felt a metallic taste in the mouth, a burning sensation on skin. They attributed it to smoke, to exhaustion. Some told each other they felt fine. By dawn, the roof fire was out. The men who had fought it were beginning to die. They just didn't know it yet. And here's what makes this story different from the version most people know. The disaster that nearly destroyed Europe wasn't the explosion. It was something building quietly beneath the reactor while the world was still processing what had already happened. If stories like this stay with you, the hidden layer beneath the famous catastrophe, this is the channel that keeps pulling that thread. They picked up pieces of the reactor core with their bare hands. They thought it was rubble. The first responders were rushed to a special hospital in Moscow. Their symptoms were unlike anything the doctors there had seen, and the Soviet government, watching this unfold, made a decision that would put millions of lives at risk. Moscow's Hospital Number 6 had a ward most Soviet citizens didn't know existed, a ward for radiation exposure. On the morning of April 26th, patients began arriving from Chernobyl. The standard dosimeters at the plant had maxed out at 3.6 Rontgen and simply stopped reading. The actual doses some men had received were incompatible with survival. Acute radiation syndrome moves in stages. First, nausea, vomiting, disorientation. Then, the latent phase. Days where the person begins to feel better, where the worst seems to have passed. It has not passed. Beneath the surface, the bone marrow is failing. The improvement is a lie the body tells itself. When the latent phase ends, the collapse is total. 28 first responders and plant workers died within weeks. Some were so radioactive their bodies were sealed in lead-lined coffins and encased in concrete. Their families were not permitted to hold them. The doctors who treated them were instructed to list the cause of death as cardiovascular failure, not radiation, not Chernobyl, because officially nothing of significance had occurred. Their dosimeters maxed out and stopped reading. The actual dose was still climbing. While men were dying in Moscow, the Soviet government faced a different calculation entirely, not how to help the victims, how long the secret could hold. The Soviet system was not built for transparency, it was built for control of information. And a catastrophic failure at a flagship nuclear facility was among the most dangerous things the state could allow to exist freely. Reports were classified. Language was managed. Radiation readings moving up the chain of command were systematically lower than reality, whether through instrument failure, falsification, or the human tendency to tell superiors what they want to hear. The city of Pripyat, 50,000 people, less than 3 kilometers from the burning reactor, was not evacuated for 36 hours. Residents were told to pack for 3 days, that they would return. In those 36 hours, children went to school. A wedding was held in Pripyat that day. Photographs exist of the celebration, the reactor visible in the background, smoke still rising. People fished in the river, breathed the air, not knowing what the air now carried. Gorbachev was briefed. The decision was made to say nothing to the world. There was only one problem. The secret had already escaped, not through a journalist or a spy, through the shoes of a man who simply showed up for work in Sweden. A wedding was held that day. The reactor was still burning in the background. On the morning of April 28th, a nuclear technician in Sweden walked through a routine checkpoint. The alarm went off. His shoes were contaminated. And they had come from 100 kilometers away. The Forsmark nuclear power plant, Sweden, April 28th, morning shift. A technician walks through a routine radiation checkpoint on his way into work. The alarm sounds. He steps back through. The alarm sounds again. His clothing is contaminated. He hadn't entered the facility yet. The contamination came from outside. The plant went into emergency protocol. More workers checked. More contamination found. The readings had no internal explanation. Swedish authorities traced the isotopic fingerprint of the contamination using wind pattern modeling back across the Baltic, back across Poland, to a specific region of Soviet Ukraine. Sweden informed the Soviet Union it would make a public announcement, that if the Soviets didn't explain what had happened, Sweden would. 60 hours after the explosion, Soviet state television broadcast 4 sentences. An accident had occurred at Chernobyl, the situation was under control, measures were being taken. That was all. Almost entirely false, because the situation was not under control. It was moving towards something the physicists involved were struggling to find words for. A Swedish worker's contaminated shoes forced the Soviet Union to tell the world. By early May, the world had settled into a quiet assumption. The explosion had happened. The fire was largely out. The worst was over. That assumption was the most dangerous thought anyone could have had. Helicopters were dropping sand, lead, and boron onto the open reactor from above. The evacuation zone was in place. The world watched and began framing Chernobyl as something that had happened past tense and was being managed. The reactor core was not smothered. It was still burning. The material being dropped was heating up inside the destroyed reactor and making things worse. The core temperature was rising, not falling. And beneath the reactor, something had been building since the night of the explosion. The molten core, burning at over 2,000 degrees Celsius, was eating through the concrete floor, slowly, invisibly, downward. Physicists ran the numbers. The numbers produced a conclusion so extreme that some refused to accept it. If the core reached the water beneath it, the resulting steam explosion would not be comparable to the first. It would be different in kind, different in scale. In classified communications, they stopped using the word accident. They used the word catastrophe, a second catastrophe, one that would make April 26th look like the prelude. The core was still burning, still moving downward, toward the water. Directly beneath the burning core was a reservoir holding millions of liters of water, and the core was falling toward it. The bubbler pool. A large water reservoir built directly beneath reactor number 4 as part of the cooling system, an engineered feature, not a flaw. It held approximately 7,000 cubic meters of water, 7 million liters. Sitting beneath a core burning at temperatures no concrete floor was designed to withstand. Soviet scientists presented their analysis in early May. The molten corium, the mixture of melted fuel, reactor components, and vaporized concrete, had already burned through several meters of floor. The rate of descent was hard to measure precisely. The conclusion was not a steam explosion of the modeled magnitude, 3 to 5 megatons. The bomb at Hiroshima was 0.015 megatons. It would destroy the 3 remaining reactor buildings, send radioactive material into the upper atmosphere in quantities that dwarfed everything already released. Prevailing winds that week were moving west and southwest into Poland, Austria, Germany, the heart of Europe. In classified documents, Soviet scientists used a specific phrase for the modeled outcome. They called it the end of Europe. 3 volunteers were needed to prevent it. Soviet scientists had a classified name for what would happen. They called it the end of Europe. To drain the pool before the core reached it, someone had to enter the flooded corridors beneath an exploded nuclear reactor, in near darkness, in radioactive water, and manually open valves they had never opened under these conditions. 3 men said yes. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. Ananenko had helped design the bubbler pool. He knew where the valves were, even in the dark. Bespalov was a fellow engineer. Baranov carried the lamp. They were given wetsuits, dosimeters, and equipment of uncertain condition. They were told radiation levels inside were unknown. No one had been in since the explosion. No instruments had gone ahead of them. They went in anyway. The water was warm, heated from above by the burning core. Emergency lighting had failed in several sections. They moved by Baranov's lamp through corridors that should have been familiar but weren't anymore. The dosimeters climbed as they moved deeper. Not instantly lethal, but high enough that every minute was a calculation between what they needed to do and what their bodies could absorb before the margin closed. Ananenko found the valves by memory and by feel. In near darkness, in irradiated water at waist height in places, the men forced them open manually. The mechanisms were stiff. The flooding had compromised the hardware. It took time they didn't have. The water began to drain. They walked back out. All 3 survived. Europe did not end. Most of Europe never knew it had been offered the chance to. 3 men walked into flooded, irradiated tunnels in the dark. They had to open valves they couldn't see. The immediate catastrophe was prevented. But anyone who thinks the story of Chernobyl ends with 3 men walking out of a tunnel hasn't looked at what the disaster left behind, what it is still doing, what it will keep doing long after everyone alive today is gone. Let's be specific, because this is not an abstraction. This is a map. A 3 to 5 megaton explosion at a site with 3 additional operational reactors. A radioactive plume driven by that week's prevailing winds, west and southwest, across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, northern Italy, Kiev, Warsaw, parts of Budapest, agricultural land feeding hundreds of millions, unusable for a generation or more, the Rhine, the Danube, groundwater across Central Europe. The Chernobyl exclusion zone today is 600 square kilometers. The modeled evacuation zone for the secondary explosion exceeded 200,000 square kilometers. Soviet scientists used the phrase "the end of Europe" not as metaphor, as a working description of what their models produced. 3 people with a lamp and a map stood between that description and its reality, and they succeeded. Which means the people living in those cities, drinking from those rivers, eating food grown in those fields, lived their entire lives never knowing how close the margin was. We exist in the shadow of a catastrophe that is invisible because it was prevented. 200,000 square kilometers, permanent. That was the evacuation zone if they had failed. The explosion didn't happen, the worst was prevented, and yet, Chernobyl did not end. It has not ended. The horror that followed is a different kind entirely. The exclusion zone is still there. It will be there for centuries. The red forest, The pine trees that absorbed so much radiation they turned brown and died, was bulldozed and buried. The trees grew back. The soil beneath them is still radioactive. Between 600,000 and 800,000 people worked the cleanup in the years that followed. They were called liquidators. Many were told varying degrees of the truth about what they were being asked to do. Their health and their children's health is still studied, still debated, still unresolved. The concrete sarcophagus built hastily over reactor number 4 began cracking within years. In 2016, a new containment structure, large enough to cover the Statue of Liberty, was sealed over it. Cost, 1.5 billion euros. Designed to last 100 years. After that, the problem belongs to whoever comes next. Because the core is still inside. The corium solidified long ago into formations. Scientists have photographed and named elephant's foot. Still radioactive enough to deliver a lethal dose within minutes of close exposure. Chernobyl did not end in 1986. It did not end when the Soviet Union did. It did not end when the shelter was sealed. It is waiting. Which story should we unfold next? A hidden decision, a disaster history simplified, a moment the world came closer to breaking than anyone was told? Leave it in the comments, because the real story is almost never the one everyone already knows. The core is still there, still radioactive, still waiting. The disaster never ended. The Ferris wheel at Pripyat has never carried a single passenger. It was completed 4 days before the explosion. It has been turning slowly in the wind ever since. Some things were built for a future that never arrived. Chernobyl is one of them.